Hello and welcome to the Sonic Cinema Podcast. My name is Brian Scuttle and thank you for joining me at www.sonic-cinema.com as well as the Sonic Cinema Podcast YouTube channel. We're continuing on with the class of 1999 with one of the bigger comedy hits of the year. This was a really interesting year for comedy. This one was from early on in the year, but it's until I revisited it recently, I kind of forgotten just how good it was. It is Harold Ramis's Analyze This, and joining me to discuss the film is a filmmaker that I've had on here before. He directed the documentary In God We Trump, and I'm pleased to be joined today by Christopher Maloney. Thank you very much.
Oh, I'm glad to be here.
I remember watching. I think the only time I had really seen this in its entirety was in theaters in 1999, and I enjoyed it at the time. I think it sort of, to a certain extent, sort of gets forgotten, and I think a big part of that is because shortly after this came out, The Sopranos debuted. And so that basically the big one of the big framing devices of that is James Gandolfini's mobster going to a therapist played by Lorraine Bracco. And so I think Analyze This kind of gets sort of its place in terms of mob movies when it comes to cinema, mob comedies. Sort of gets forgotten to a certain extent because of that, but it really shouldn't, because what Harold Ramis does here is a really entertaining movie.
Yeah, The Sopranos is pretty much the same premise, except not funny.
Yeah, yeah, it's definitely the more serious end of the spectrum. I wasn't terribly surprised when I read on IMDb that Scorsese was Warner Brothers had approached Scorsese about directing this, and he turned it down. And I'm kind of glad he did, because first of all, he gave us Bringing Out the Dead this year, which was really good, and then but also I feel like you kind of needed a filmmaker with a more comedic sensibility to make this movie work because of how high concept it kind of gets.
Yeah, what I like about this movie, well, first of all, I was late to seeing it because when it first came out, I was 13, and it was rated R, so yeah. I couldn't get in to see it on my own. But I remember, like, it was talked about a lot that year, and the big deal was that Robert De Niro was in a comedy, which was like back then it was still kind of a novelty. He had done like Midnight Run with Charles Grodin, which was pretty much a straight comedy.
Yeah.
But other than that, like it just seemed like he was stepping outside of the box, which I think people were excited about. And then it actually turned out to be pretty good and pretty funny. But yeah, what you said about Harold Ramis, like Groundhog Day is one of my favorite movies, which Harold Ramis directed. And I like that he obviously knows what's funny and he knows how to be funny, but he also knows how to put a film together.
Yeah.
So like the beginning of Analyze This, when you see the black and white photo montage and De Niro's voiceover narration, it kind of, like, to me, when I see that, it kind of lets me know that I'm seeing an actual movie in the hands of a filmmaker who knows how to make a movie, not just going for laughs.
Right.
Because, like, I consider comedies there are comedies that are more like serving the genre of comedies and just getting laughs at any expense. And then there are movies that are very good, well-done movies that happen to be funny, and I would put this in the latter category.
I would definitely agree with that assessment. And yeah, I couldn't help but think, rewatching this with that introduction, it sort of felt like a spiritual sequel to Goodfellas, and like what might have happened to Jimmy Conway had he, had he like gotten out of prison or whatever. And I agree with that assessment where it's a movie that just happens to be funny, and this really does. I think that's one of the keys to why this movie works is that it feels so much more. It feels very much like a genuine mob movie as opposed to a comedy set within the world of organized crime.
Yeah. There, other than like, in addition to the photos and the narration at the beginning, I think just having some of the names involved that they have involved are other indications that this is going to be a movie to take seriously.
Yeah.
So, De Niro's one, Harold Ramis, and then also Kenneth Lonergan was one of the screenwriters. Yeah. However, and we know him from Gangs of New York and Manchester by the Sea more recently, but he was on Mark Maron's podcast, and he said that he's never actually seen Analyze This because, because by the time the movie was made, it had been rewritten so many times that anything that he had done was just completely unrecognizable. So, which makes sense because I don't see him like doing broad comedy the way that Analyze This kind of is, but. Yeah, Kenneth Lonergan's name on there just is another sign that this is going to be like a movie to take seriously.
Yeah, and I was blown away when I saw his name in the credits. I'm like, you're kidding me. I did not remember that he was a part of this, and I mean when you say what he said, when you recount what he said on Mark Maron, it does kind of make sense because of the fact that it's like. The year after this, he did You Can Count on Me. Like you said, he also co-wrote Gangs of New York and Manchester by the Sea. And so it's one of those things where you just really don't... Yeah, you don't really hear that voice of his. But at the same time, I wonder if that was one of the things where... that maybe that draft that Lonergan had done is sort of the one that they brought to Scorsese because of the fact that they ended up working together on Gangs of New York. But yeah, the thing that's really fun about this movie is the way that it's kind of a natural extension to the movies like Goodfellas and Casino that Scorsese had done in the 90s in the crime world. But it's also, it has those moments where the humor comes out of it very naturally. And one of the things that I really kind of like about this movie and where it sort of fits within the larger conversation when it comes to the the movies of 1999, in a way this movie is really it's obstinately about a mobster who is having anxiety and panic attacks, and he goes to a therapist. That's a funny setup, but really I think one of the things that's kind of interesting about the way this plays out is that it's also looking at traditional ideals of masculinity when it comes to De Niro's character. And that's a big thing that was going on in the movies of this year, if you really think about it.
How would you connect that idea with other movies?
Well, I mean, I think if you look at I would think if you look at movies like American Beauty, if you look at movies like Office Space, if you look at movies like Fight Club, and even I recently recorded a podcast on David Lynch's The Straight Story. In a way, they're all movies that are looking, or especially the first three that I pointed out, those three movies I feel like the main characters are finding themselves less than satisfied with their personal lives, and they're trying to figure out they're having identity crises, and I think a part of that for them comes from the idea that the notions of masculinity that we sort of grew up and were raised to, believe were the case weren't necessarily applying to them in the lives that they ended up living. And I think for Analyze This, I mean, we have very, if you look at Goodfellas, if you look at Casino, if you look at movies, about organized crime, a lot of those characters there's very particular type of masculine characteristics that are brought to those characters and brought to writing those type of characters. And De Niro's character in this movie is he's at a point where he finds himself, even though he doesn't realize it at first, he's kind of questioning it. He's kind of figuring out, it's like, what's going on? Why am I feeling this way? Because when he first has his first panic attack, he goes to the hospital and the doctor's telling him what it is, but he just refuses to believe it. And one of the things, it's funny because I've been in therapy for about a decade now, and watching this movie after that decade is really kind of interesting because of the fact that one of the things that I've sort of figured out for myself throughout that process is that the ideas that are passed down, were passed down from my parents' generation to my generation, my grandparents to, so on and so forth, how those ideas, they if you adhere yourself, there's nothing inherently wrong with adhering yourself to those ideas, but if you come to realize that they don't necessarily apply to you, and you have something, and that can really mess you up. And I think that's one of the things that Paul, De Niro's character here, is really struggling with.
I hadn't thought of it like that, but I think you're right. Like when the first time he reluctantly goes in to see Dr. Sobel, in secret because it could be bad for his image,
right?
As a crime boss, if other rivals found out that he was seeing a therapist, because it would be seen as a sign of weakness.
Yeah,
and that's the whole, that's the whole masculine idea that he has to keep up. He doesn't even want, he tells his associate Jelly not to even listen. So he doesn't want him to hear what he's talking about.
Yeah,
and then Dr. Sobel's telling him, well, it sounds like you're having panic attacks. And he gets very defensive about the word panic, which I guess also is seen as a sign of weakness. So I guess for me, the biggest, so when people see it now, if they've never seen it before, I think it is less groundbreaking because, as you mentioned, we're more, I think as a society, 20 years later, we're more familiar with what therapy is.
Yeah.
Have experience with it.
Mm-hmm.
And we're also more comfortable with De Niro doing lots of different silly things.
Yeah.
Up till then, he hadn't. I mean, that was before Meet the Parents, and then the next year he did Rocky and Bullwinkle.
Yeah.
And he wasn't hosting SNL yet or appearing on that. So
right.
We're all familiar with a funny Robert De Niro now, and back then that was a really new thing for us to get used to.
Yeah. And the thing that I like about De Niro, one of the things I really like about De Niro's performance here is that he plays it very straight. and lets the comedy come out of the material and the situation that's he's in at that moment. And I like the, and yeah, I mean, it's this, in a way, this is when you were talking about, how we view therapy now, and sort of how therapy is, the therapy process of going to therapy is not as much of a mystery now as it was then, even though, I mean, there are still movies where, and TV shows where when it's done, it's kind of played with the familiar tropes that we're used to. It does also, this movie in particular also plays to that idea. Now, granted, in here with Paul Vitti, the De Niro character, it's a valid one. I completely see why why it would be to his disadvantage and embarrassment for other members of the other crime families to know, because it would be a sign of weakness. And that also kind of points to the stigma that's always been brought up when it comes to therapy and the idea of mental illness. Just the idea that if you go to therapy, it's a sign of weakness, which it really isn't, because of the fact that it's an important part for some people. For a lot of people, it's an important part of a process that they need to go through in their lives.
Sure. Yeah, and in the movie, therapy, well, the psychiatrist, played by Billy Crystal, is kind of made fun of a little bit too. Like his practice is made fun of, and like he suggests to Paul, he says, like, when I'm angry, I punch a pillow.
Yeah.
And then Paul unloads a few rounds into a pillow. Mm-hmm. Like I felt like that was kind of in a snide way, kind of offering commentary on psychotherapy, almost like for a guy like Paul Vitti, like what's hitting a pillow going to do for him? Mm-hmm. And I think almost like the bigger idea was therapy's great, but it doesn't solve everything.
Yeah.
Like he still ends up, I don't want to give anything away for people who haven't seen it, but he still ends up like having to pay a penance for certain things that he's done for being in the mob.
Yeah. Yeah, and it does play to the idea where it's like, especially for a character like Paul, the traditional ideas of therapy that, Ben, the Billy Crystal character's espousing or trying to get him to do, they're just not going to work, because that's not who Paul is. That's not who Paul Vitti is. And it's, and you brought up the hitting the pillow, because how is that going to help him? But it's just really such an entertaining movie, and the thing that's great about it is with Dr. Sobel, Billy Crystal's character, is that he's got some anxiety too, because not only is he just getting married, but he also has anxiety about his practice. And I think his career as a therapist, because of the fact that his dad is a renowned therapist. And so naturally there are going to be issues that he has to deal with in a way, the same way that Paul Vitti does.
Yeah, it's interesting that what ends up being the thing that connects them is that they both have these complex relationships with their fathers. Mm-hmm. And like that, I mean, I feel like the movie didn't have to go there. Like it would have been funny without it, but that's like the extra mile that they went to add some gravity to it. And I remember reading in this this interview with Harold Ramis, where he was talking about how the thing that I don't know if Robert De Niro like especially was looking for a comedy, but the thing that interested him about this story was he wanted to research what it was like for someone who has debilitating panic attacks. Mm-hmm. And that was the interesting thing for him. That was the thing. That was the way that he could see his way into the character and into the movie, was by researching it as a method actor the way he does everything else. It just, he's also going to be funny along the way. But like the symptoms that are shown for Paul Vitti, having panic attacks, suffering from depression, even sexual dysfunction. I mean, those are all, there are details in that are grounded in fact.
Yeah. Well, and it's also funny because, like you said earlier, he's very sheepish about starting therapy. He wants to start in private, and he's really not a good patient for a lot of it, because obviously in a way, there are times in this movie where he sort of reminds me of Bill Murray's character in What About Bob, where he's just passing those boundaries that are supposed to exist between therapist and patient. And I mean, he follows Sobel to Miami, ends up inadvertently crashing his wedding, and it's one of those things where this movie is very one of the things that's so wonderful about De Niro's performance is he doesn't overplay it. He's not hamming it up. He takes, and to hear you talk about sort of his way into the material, it makes a lot of sense because of the fact that when those moments of catharsis happen, it's a really great performance by De Niro, and it feels very genuine as opposed to something that's just kind of played for laughs, because the laughs in that scene come from the context, but it's not necessarily from it's not from how De Niro's playing it. It's just in the particular context of where the movie is at that point is what makes that funny. Yeah.
And What About Bob? Richard Dreyfuss says that Bob Wiley is a textbook narcissist, and I guess that's true of Paul Vitti too.
Yeah,
I hadn't connected before about how they both follow their psychiatrists on their vacations, and it doesn't occur to actually, even Dr. Sobel says to Paul Vitti, "You're not used to hearing no very often." No, I hear it all the time, but it's more like no, please no.
Yeah. This is a really great pairing for Crystal and De Niro. I mean, I can't remember, like, other than, like, Monsters, Inc., I can't remember anything else after this that Billy Crystal did that was really, really good as far as the type of work they did. So this might be one of the last really great performances from him. Lisa Kudrow plays his fiance and wife. It's kind of a thankless role, unfortunately. I kind of think so, at least.
Yeah, I think she did. She brought something to it, but she's not given a whole lot to do.
Mm-hmm. If I remember the sequel correctly, I feel like she's got a little bit more to do in the sequel. I can't remember.
I saw it, but I don't really remember much from it.
Yeah.
So, Billy Crystal. I get, like, when I think of him, I think of When Harry Met Sally and City Slickers, Forget Paris, and I like all those movies. But yeah, I guess after Analyze This, there's not much is coming to mind.
Yeah. And it's kind of a shame, but I mean, I think it was just. It's one of those things where sort of the landscape of comedy was kind of shifting at this point, and it was going more towards broader comedies as opposed to... Now, I mean, granted, City Slickers is a pretty broad comedy, but at the same time, there really wasn't a place for an actor like Billy Crystal outside of, like, animated films. And I mean, he did some it looks like he's done some TV work, but otherwise, he hadn't really done much as far as movies and big movies after this. I do want to talk a bit about Harold Ramis because it's a real shame that we lost him when we did. And it's a shame that after this he didn't really do a whole lot that was particularly good. I didn't dislike Bedazzled, but I didn't think it wasn't that great. Analyze That is okay. It's an okay sequel. I always kind of thought so. The one of his I did really like after this was The Ice Harvest. I really enjoyed that movie. It was kind of his spin on the sort of Fargo dark comedy type thing that I really liked.
Mm-hmm.
And then his last feature was Year One, which was not good at all. But
I remember when Year One came out, Roger Ebert said, he said, Harold Ramis is one of the nicest people I've ever met in this business, which is why it makes me so sad that Year One happened to him.
Yeah. And I mean, that was it. I mean, he directed a few episodes of he only directed one episode of The Office, I guess, after that. Looking at his filmography on IMDb.com. It's a shame because I sort of think and it's funny because of it. It's kind of funny that I brought up about Bob because I was going to say I really like this as a point of discussion with regards to somebody like Harold Ramis, who obviously is best known for Ghostbusters and Stripes, and he did Caddyshack as a director, Vacation as a director. He's known in Multiplicity, which I'm not a huge fan of, but at the same time, I really enjoy what he was able to give Michael Keaton in that movie.
It's not material. Yeah, it's not without its charms.
Yeah, it's one. He's one of those film. And then you mentioned Groundhog Day, which is absolutely wonderful. It's one of the best comedies ever made.
I agree,
without question. And I feel like because of the fact that it not only been so long, it's been about 5 years since he passed, but it had also been so long since he'd done a really great comedy. You know, bringing up about Bob, that's directed by Frank Oz, and when I talked about Bowfinger earlier this year for this series, it's sad that Frank Oz and Harold Ramis is sort of the same way, where it's like to a certain generation, like people don't really appreciate just how good filmmakers like those guys are or were in the comedy genre. And I mean, I think Ramis, as far as his career, I mean, it's not a brief career, but it feels brief. As far as feature filmmaking, it's like he really gave us, even if I'm not a fan of all of his movies, I feel like all of his films are interesting to me, even the ones that don't really work because of what he might be trying to do with them.
Right.
So the character of Jelly, who you mentioned earlier, was played by Joe Vitarelli, who is somebody who was very much typecast in a particular type of mobster role. I think this is probably, of the performances of his that I've seen, this is probably one of the best, if not the best, he probably ever gave.
Oh yeah, he's great. He's hilarious. His face has so much character in it.
Yeah, and it's a performance where, I mean, he's very much himself. He's very he plays it like he would play any of his other characters. It's just he happens to be playing comedic material as opposed to serious material, and he's so wonderful in the way he is. Especially, I think one of my favorite moment of his is when they are getting married, and he's like up there sneaking up to try to get Ben to go see Paul, and I think it's the day of the meet at the end. And he's trying to get him to do that, and it's just that scene is so perfectly played. It's really hilarious. I'd forgotten Chaz Palminteri was in this movie as sort of Paul Vidi's biggest rival, and he's got some good moments in here. The phone call with he and Paul have is probably one of my favorite moments in the entire film. It's just really funny the way that plays out, and the way it starts out one way and they're both like, yeah, who's this? Yeah, you know who this is. Oh, who is
me?
And they're trying not to say something, but at the same time it's just such a fun moment there. Let's see.
It's nice to see like two actors like that who are so good at sizing each other up.
Yeah.
And they're both like, it's almost like it's a pissing contest. Like you could take that scene between the two of them, like kind of literally bumping chests against each other almost, and it could be in a drama.
Yeah.
Like where violence is just a wrong term away. But one little tweak and it becomes very funny. It's nice seeing two actors who know what they're doing just kind of go at each other.
Yeah. Yeah, and it helps that, I mean, Palminteri we had seen play very funny before because he was Oscar nominated for Bullets Over Broadway, the Woody Allen film, which has always been one of my favorite Woody Allen films. So him being funny is not terribly surprising, but we talked about De Niro and the ways that he's funny in this movie and the way he delivers lines and the way he plays off of Jelly is like one of my favorite interactions is when they're trying to calm Ben down after the guy flies out the window at their first weighing attempt in Miami.
Yeah.
He goes, "Hey, did they find that suicide note?" And Jelly goes, "No, but they will in a minute." and lines like, "You get a dictionary and you find out what this closure is." And there's just really wonderful moments of dialogue and character beats. And this is and the reason this is so important to have a comedic filmmaker like Ramis is that we talked about it earlier, where it's like you're building this criminal world that you could legitimately take seriously because of the actors who are involved, and then it's the tone of the dialogue and the tone of the character interactions that make it a comedy. And it's the situations that build out of different situations that make it comedy.
Now, this makes me wonder, do you think that Scorsese could have done it? Do you think he could have pulled it off and it funny? I'm going to say no.
I don't know that he wasn't. That's an excellent question. I kind of wondered about that myself because it's funny because I remember reading, when De Niro convinced him to make King of Comedy because De Niro was looking for comedy. If you watch King of Comedy, it really kind of isn't a comedy.
No, it's not.
There are moments of dark comedy, to be sure.
Yeah.
But it's not a comedy. And the thing is, it's like, I don't know if... I think the closest thing Scorsese has really done to comedies, at least based on what I've seen, are After Hours, which is more of a dark comedy, and The Wolf of Wall Street. And I don't know that he would have necessarily, because of how much he had worked, I think probably because of the fact that I wonder if part of the reason he didn't want to do this is because he didn't want to get sort of pigeonholed where people are saying, oh, look, Scorsese's making another gangster movie. You know, like we see so many people being reductive about his filmography online when it comes to his Marvel comments, even though like not even a fifth of his films are gangster films. But whether he could, I'm not sure if he could necessarily have gotten the tone that Ramis did. And I think it takes and that's not a knock on him. It's not a knock on Scorsese. I just don't know if I don't know that necessarily, because I mean, even Wolf of Wall Street is basically a drama, but it's got a lot of really funny moments in it. If he had gotten this movie, if he had been given the opportunity to make this movie now, I think maybe there's a chance he could have done a really good job with it, but I don't know. At the time, I just don't know they necessarily had it in him.
Right. I don't think. I like I've seen in interviews and on talk shows, he is a funny guy.
Oh yeah.
But that never. I don't. Yeah, that's just not his gift.
Mm-hmm. But I think it is important that, it is important that Ramis is, and the fact that it's also important that Ramis is able to build worlds where comedy happens, but also feel very real and very authentic. And I think that's one of the things that, and even though he didn't direct Ghostbusters, I think that's one of the things that he probably brought to the material along with Dan Aykroyd in writing the first Ghostbusters, certainly, where it's like they set up this world that is where very plausibly you could have ghosts take place, as well as these guys being very funny guys in spite of in spite of that world. And I think that's the most important thing is how is the comedy coming out? Is it coming out of the characters, or is it coming out of just the filmmakers trying to be funny? And I think it's important that just basically doing slapstick humor, or I think the Zuckers had done a mob parody earlier the year before this, which was basically one of their broad spoofs, and that's the wrong way to go with something like this.
Oh yeah, with Lloyd Bridges, I think.
Yeah, it was called Mafia, and I think it was the last thing Lloyd Bridges ever did, and it wasn't that good.
No, I had forgotten about that movie.
Yeah, I barely remembered it until I was talking right there, but I think that's I just really, I'm really glad that I had the opportunity to rewatch this movie, because I'd forgotten a lot of the entertainment value in it, and the ending where Ben Sobel is basically in sort of a fish out of water situation of his own, where he's sort of Jelly's convinced him that he has to represent Paul at this big meeting that's taking place that we've heard about throughout the entire movie. It's a really nice showcase of Crystal hamming it up, but it also feels very much in character for the character. Doesn't just feel like, oh, we need to give Billy Crystal some wacky moments. It also feels like, hey, this is he sort of, in a way, he's sort of, I don't know what I'm trying to say here. It sort of feels like he's trying to he's basically going off of what he knows of, organized crime through like movies and through sort of what he's seen from Paul, but obviously not really knowing what he's doing.
Yeah, that's true. He spent however much time with Paul Vitti, kind of more or less getting immersed in that world. And still, when it comes to that meeting, he knows. He doesn't do a very convincing job of like showing that he knows the terminology or talking about, which just makes it funny.
And I think one of the things that's really great about that scene is the fact that he basically turns his therapist eye on the other people at the meeting, and that's what sort of throws them off guard.
Yeah.
So
right. By kind of yeah, he like when he asks like why someone feels like he always has to raise his voice, and then suddenly everyone else is like kind of like they've been asking themselves those questions all along.
Yeah.
Like that's like another way that psychiatry in general is kind of used as a device in the movie, which I guess like it helps the movie that it was 20 years ago and without, like I said before, without as much common knowledge about psychiatry as there is now. It helps that those questions might have seemed more poignant, or like his insights might have seemed more poignant now than if the movie were made today.
Right. Yeah, and I mean it's one of those things where it's like it's hard to you can't really make it's hard to do comedy when it comes to psychiatry and therapy and stuff like that. You kind of have to a certain extent, you have to take that idea seriously, even if you sort of poke holes in it. Like we've seen, like the funny thing about Paul Vitti translating, hit that pillow, Paul, into shooting the pillow is that's who Paul Vitti is, and that's how he interprets that. And it's like that's where it's funny. You understand why Billy Crystal's character Sobo's saying that, but you also understand why Vitti reacts that way when it's like, well, that doesn't help.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, like out of the two of them, one of them is going to absorb the other.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one character like takes all the oxygen out of the room, and then Dr. Sobel is just kind of like desperately trying to survive it. It made me think of when Marlon Brando was in The Freshman, and he was kind of doing a parody of Don Corleone.
Yeah.
And then in this movie, Robert De Niro was kind of doing a parody of a few characters he had played. And then there's even the Godfather dream sequence.
Which I was... Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say it. It seems like, I mean, both Marlon Brando and Robert De Niro were both known for being such intense method actors.
Yeah.
That it was like when they did finally get to the part of their careers where they seemed to be more interested in having fun and not taking themselves as seriously. It was really kind of surprising, but it seems like, I guess maybe for Marlon Brando, it was The Freshman.
Yeah.
And for Robert De Niro, it was this.
And yeah, you brought up the Godfather reference, which is hilarious because they play it very directly, very much in like shot for shot. It borders on parody because they're basically recreating it. The thing that I couldn't help but think it though is that shouldn't that be Godfather 2? since that's the one that De Niro's in.
Right.
But I mean, there's not really is. I mean, I understand why they did that scene because it's a very, very powerful scene in Godfather. It's about Fredo. It's about Fredo watching his father die, not really being able to help him, and that ties into Paul's character. And there's not really a scene like that in Godfather 2, but still, it was a little amusing thing that I thought about. I mean, he played Don Corleone in Godfather 2, so I mean that kind of works.
Right.
But
yeah, it's because of that. It's kind of a fourth wall thing.
Yeah,
an inside joke. Because I remember, like when I watched it, thinking if you follow the logic of Dr. Sobel knowing the Godfather movies,
yeah,
then he's familiar with an actor named Robert De Niro who played Vito Corleone in the second cut, but now he's treating Paul Vitti. It's a weird rabbit hole you can go down if you really want to.
Yeah, I'm not even sure if we're going into fourth wall. That might be like fifth wall and just completely shattering the celluloid altogether at that point with that logic. Yeah, I mean it is definitely one of the, but it's such a funny moment. It's because of the fact that Ramis he just recreates the scene. That's all he does, and it is just completely perfect for the point that Sobel was trying to get at with Paul Vitti at that point.
Yeah, I admire how with recreating that scene, the lighting was spot on.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just like Gordon Willis.
Yeah.
So, and that's another, like one of the themes that we're hitting on is that this is a real filmmaker at work.
Yeah.
So, like a lesser filmmaker probably would not have included the detail that I notice when I see it, which is the colors in that scene.
Right.
But it's there because it's Ramis.
Yeah, because it does sort of have that washed out feel that Gordon Willis's cinematography in that movie, in that particular scene has. And that's one of the things that makes the that makes it's a loving tribute to it more than it is, oh, we're gonna make fun of this scene. It's not what they're doing. We're going to recreate for a specific purpose for our movie. And that's one of the things I really like about it. Did you have anything more that you wanted to bring up? I will say I really like Howard Shore's score here. I kind of forgotten that he had scored it. And it's one of those things where it's like you forget that Howard Shore is a composer who's capable of doing. I mean, this isn't a jolly comedic score, but it plays to the truth of what this movie is, as far as being a comedy about the world of crime.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's another one of those names that when you see it, you're like, oh, okay, this is a movie then.
Yeah.
Like this is an actual film that we're going to be watching.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of comedies, especially, like you often don't think of the score.
Mm-hmm.
Even some good comedies, who wrote the music doesn't really come to mind.
Yeah.
But yeah, someone like Howard Shore, you pretty much have to take him seriously. I know that, like I said, back when it was released and I was too young to go see it, it seemed like everybody was talking about it for a while. And I know it opened at number 1 in the box office.
Yeah.
And I remember Roger Ebert liked it. But yeah, I think it holds up.
Oh yeah, I definitely do as well. It's and at some point I do want to analyze that to see how I feel about it, but at the same, I know I felt, if I remember correctly, that one goes a bit broader when it comes to the comedy, and I think that's part of the reason why it didn't really work, other than the fact that comedy sequels hardly really stand up to the originals. But no, I was very pleasantly surprised and not pleasantly surprised, but pleasantly delighted about the fact that this movie holds up as well as it does. And I mean, that's a tribute to Ramis as a filmmaker. It's a tribute to the work that he gets out of De Niro and Billy Crystal and everybody in this movie in realizing the best way to approach this movie was, okay, so we're going to tell you a story. It just happens to be funny. It's going to have some elements that you're familiar with, but it's also going to have some. It's going to be the combination of those elements that I think, you're going to leave the theater, stop watching, and realize that it's, this is what it has to offer, and I think that's one of the things that this movie really does well.
Yeah, I mean, De Niro kept doing comedies after that. To me, they never matched this one.
Yeah,
and Billy Crystal has continued doing movies after this. To me, they haven't matched this one, so it was really, and same with Harold Ramis too.
Yeah.
So it was really kind of the high mark in a lot of ways.
Yeah. I mean, I think the only comedy De Niro did after this that is even remotely on this level is the first Meet the Parents movie. And it's because of how familiar and how familiar that concept is and the interplay between him and Ben Stiller and how on point that is. I mean, that's really the only one that I can think of that's probably even remotely close to this.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for joining me today, Chris. I'm glad we were able to talk about this. And I'm looking forward to our other discussion where we talk about the talented Mr. Ripley for this series.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you're doing this series because 1999, I do remember being, like I said, I do remember being 13 years old. I do remember being subscribed to Entertainment Weekly and reading about movies that I was too young to drive out and see. But it's nice to see them all get revisited now.
Yeah. Yeah, and so many of them still hold up remarkably well and even get better with age. And I think that's one of the things. It's a tribute to what the filmmakers who made films at that year and sort of what they did and how they did it. And if I do something like this again, I'm not going to do it quite the same way, but I'm really glad that I did this the way that I did to start out because of the fact that it gave me an opportunity to revisit all of these movies and to really watch these films and just sort of parse out sort of what I think I might have identified with back then and sort of how I feel about now and how they hold up. And yeah, this is one that holds up very well.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank Christopher Maloney for joining me today to analyze this. It was a really great discussion. I'm glad we were able to do it. He will be back on the class of 1999 to discuss the talented Mr. Ripley, and I'm looking forward to that discussion as well. Thank you for joining me at the Sonic Cinema podcast. Thank you for sticking with us on the class of 1999 series. It's just hitting the backstretch, and we're getting ready to finish things up for the year, and it's going to be a busy wrap-up. I'm looking forward to it. Thank you for joining me at patreon.com/SonicCinema, as well as Sonic Cinema, www.sonic-cinema.com. This is Brian Scuttle, and I hope you have a good day.